I wanted to have a chance to discuss with you some issues concerning hydraulic fracturing. As an engineer and a long-standing researcher in how objects and faults fracture, what insights you have in terms of the sorts of questions that that regulators, policymakers, and others don't actually ask you.
The single most important aspect of unconventional gas development from shale that hardly anybody gets, and I'm talking about the general public, policymakers, even regulators, the only entities that get it are the operators and a few individuals like myself who really understand the nexus between geology, geochemistry, engineering, science, and technology. And let me tell you what that issue is. It's called spatial intensity. As you know, people are a bit upset about how things have progressed in a place like Pennsylvania with Marcellus shale. What people don't understand yet is that we haven't even started. Pennsylvania has been being developed for shale gas since 2007. And in that period of time, there have been roughly 5,500 wells drilled, and people think, well, that's a lot. But of those 5,500 wells that have been drilled, only about half have been fracked. And that half that's been fracked constitute about 2%. 2% of the eventual so-called build-out of Pennsylvania. So someone could fly over all of the areas of Pennsylvania right now that have been developed from Marcellus and say, well, that ain't so bad. That's not like mountaintop removal in West Virginia. Well, not yet. Only about 2% of the wells that are going to be fracked have been fracked. Yet, if we look at the consequences already, the number of individual private water wells that have already been contaminated, the number of health incidences that have occurred, the number of spills that have occurred, the number of truck accidents that have occurred. It's pretty simple now to start forecasting, prognosing, crystal ball gazing, and say, well, what's it going to be like? If it's like this with 2%, what's it going to be like at 10%? What's it going to be like at 20%? It's going to be hellacious. The industry knows it. The gas is everywhere there's shale. Not in uniform quantities, of course. They still have to drill exploration wells to find their so-called hot spots, a county here, a county there. But all of the prognoses that I'm reading out of the industry literature is that New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, a little bit of Virginia, are going to be subjected to at least 200,000 Marcellus shale gas wells. And that's just the Marcellus. Of course, they promise us there's also the Utica and a couple of others. So I'm repeating myself, but the single most important aspect that nobody gets yet is that it hasn't even started yet.
For those of us following up on this who are in the healthcare area, one of the big concerns is that there should be a pathway for exposure. In other words, is there a way in which either the chemicals that we're putting into slick water or into drilling muds, or the flowback produced waters, or the emissions coming back out as fugitive emissions, is there any way that that can actually expose people?
Sure. The pathways are numerous and obvious. I categorize them as from deep underground, from the surface, and from the air. And this kind of intense spatial development, number one, as I just said, is going to poke a few 100,000 holes in the ground that weren't there. 330 million years of sequestration of hydrocarbons, heavy metals, salts, naturally occurring radioactive material is being de-sequestered. We're taking all that out and putting fresh water down. Brilliant. What an exchange. What we just spent the last 30 or 40 million years doing, which is sequestering a lot of carbon dioxide and putting a lot of water, drinkable water, on the surface of the earth. We're reversing it. Thank you. Wonderful. So yeah, poking a couple 100,000 holes in the Marcellus, every one of those holes has to have a gasket. It's called a cement job. And we know that those gaskets fail at an alarming rate initially because they're really hard to put in place. And most of them will fail eventually. By eventually I mean within a lifetime of a human. Which means we're going to have tens of thousands of leaky gaskets. And that means everything that was down there sequestered now has a pathway upwards into an underground source of drinking water or all the way to the surface. So that's pathway number one. Poking all those holes and not being able to gasket them while they're operating and then successfully plug them when all these wells go out of operation. So we're postponing a major part of the problem. At the surface, you have to bring chemicals to a well pad, and then you have to bring those chemicals and all the other waste products away from the well pad. That means transporting and storing. Anytime you transport and store hazardous material, you run the risk of spills. And obviously, since it's spatially intense, we're going to have lots of trucks, we're going to have lots of waste pits, we're going to have lots of pipelines, all of which at some point or another are going to cause some level of problem. And then finally, air. What comes up out of the well is a gas. Not just one gas, but all the other sisters and brothers of methane that want to come along for the ride. And not all of it goes into the pipeline. Right? As we know, and as we're learning, a significant amount of it gets into the air in the form of hydrocarbon-based pollutants near the well pads that is capable of influencing people within a few miles, but also on a global scale. Again, spatial intensity. You're going to put 200,000 wells in Pennsylvania, New York, West Virginia, Ohio. All those wells and all their ancillary infrastructure, compressor stations, processing stations, pipelines, storage units, they leak. So we're going to be contributing to climate change in a way and at a time that we can least afford to. And to then say that this is the transition fuel that gets us to a sustainable and clean and climate-friendly future is absurd. It's walking the plank. It's not a bridge.
Yeah.
A bridge has a near end and a far end. You want to get to the other end. This is a plank. Here we are. That's where we're going with this.
You're one of the founding board members of Physicians, Scientists and Engineers for Healthy Energy alongside myself. This organization is conceived as a multidisciplinary group with people from a range of different backgrounds. How would you say this type of collaboration is important in addressing the science and the evidence of this new technology?
It's fundamentally the right combination of expertise. As I tell the various agreed landowners, sometimes they're lawyers who contact me for information, how can we prove a case? No one person has all the expertise. Case in point, any one of these 200,000 wells that are going to be drilled in the Marcellus over the next N years can leak initially. Well, somebody has to be able to say, I understand the technology and the engineering of drilling, casing, cementing, and fracking a well. And I understand all the things that can go wrong. I understand why they go wrong. I understand when they go wrong. And I understand where they go wrong. So if I read a well record, a daily diary that's kept by the operator of every single thing that happens on a well, then I can pinpoint, this is what went wrong, this is why it went wrong, this is where it went wrong, and this is when it went wrong. But that's insufficient. Okay. Next thing you have to have is a geohydrologist who can say, well, if that went wrong there, then, here are the consequences from a groundwater flow point of view. If the gas well is up gradient of somebody's water well, and I can say what leaked from this well, when it started leaking, and where it started leaking, then the next person in the chain, another kind of engineer or scientist, geohydrologist, can say, and 1, 2, 3 days later, or 3 weeks later, or 1 year later, we can expect this concentration of contaminants to arrive in this person's well water. And that's not sufficient. Okay?
What else do you need?
Well, you need the engineer to say what went
Right.
wrong. You need the scientist to say and what the consequence was. And then somebody down there has to be a health professional that says, I can match up the contaminants the chemistry of those contaminants, the hazardous nature of those contaminants, with the health consequences of the people who drank that water or breathed that air. That's called chain of evidence, from my point of view. Okay, you got to have at least those three: engineer, scientist, physician, working together to show causality. There's a lot of coincidence making that the industry always says, well, it was just a coincidence. The well was always contaminated. You just noticed it now because we came into town. And on the other side, the extremist environmentalists, the people who don't think it all through, immediately draw causality conclusions from what might just be coincidence. But you really need an organization like PSE and its constituents, its advisors, its board, its members, who have all the kinds of technical expertise necessary to observe, cause, and prove effect.
And one of the things that PSE is very concerned about as an organization is that the evidence is presented in vetted, peer-reviewed publications. Why is that so important?
It's fundamentally important because in our society, in our civilization, the cornerstone, the wellspring, the gold standard of evidence is anonymous peer review. Without it, we're all bloggers. We're just opinionators. My opinion is as good as yours. My blog has fancier graphics. More people read my blog, therefore I should be believed. I'm sorry. No, that's not the way it works. I'm very concerned that not only do we have the kinds of pollution that we've been talking about, water pollution, air pollution, people pollution, we're seeing science pollution, the diminution of the importance of anonymous peer review as exercised by the very best journals, administered by the best editorial boards, people who are not going to be influenced by financial conflict of interest or by personal aggrandizement. On average, that's the whole idea. You have enough people working at any journal on the editorial boards, in their reviewer suite, and in their publisher to know that they have in that journal a very grave responsibility for society. It's at least as important as the responsibility that the media have. I would argue it's even more important because without the ability for, bringing the conversation to an end here, the people, the citizenry, the policymakers, the legislators, the regulators, to discern best science from somebody's opinion, it's hopeless.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Yeah.